They built 50 cabins on my family's land, a pristine 20-acre inheritance that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The HOA president, this queen of suburban tyranny, told me to my face that my deed was basically just a piece of paper, a historical suggestion. She thought I was just some old guy she could roll over. Man, she had no idea who she was dealing with. They didn't just build cabins. They built themselves a multi-million-dollar prison of debt. And I was the one holding the key. How's that for a crazy story? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you're not going to want to miss this. It all started back in what I call the year of the deed. It was a somber Monday, the kind with that heavy gray sky that just sits on your shoulders. My grandfather, a man who was more mountain than man, had passed away a few months prior, and the final piece of his estate had just cleared probate. His land, 20 acres of untouched North Carolina woods, bordering a new, aggressively manicured housing development called Willow Creek Estates. For me, this wasn't just dirt and trees. This was the place where I built my first disastrous treehouse at age 8. The place my grandfather taught me to identify oak versus maple. The place where the silence was so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. At 50 years old, recently retired from a career as a civil engineer, this land was supposed to be my epilogue, my quiet place. 9:14 a.m., I stood there that first day, holding the freshly stamped deed. The paper still warm from the printer at the lawyer's office. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It felt like coming home. I saw the neat, identical houses of Willow Creek peeking through the tree line. At the time, they were just neighbors. A little too close for comfort, maybe, but harmless. Dude, was I ever wrong? I spent the first few weeks just walking the property, relearning its contours, tracing the small creek that gave the fancy development its name. I found the old stone markers my granddad had shown me as a kid, the ones that definitively marked our property line. They were solid, immovable, a testament to a time when a man's word and a well-placed rock were as good as any law. My first interaction with the HOA was deceptively pleasant. It was a Thursday afternoon, maybe 2 weeks in. A golf cart came bouncing up my long gravel driveway. At the wheel was a woman who introduced herself as Diane. Let me tell you about Diane. She was probably in her mid-50s, with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, and sunglasses so large they seemed to be a separate, smaller face worn over her own. She had the kind of forced, toothy smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind you see on sharks right before they bite. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was the living, breathing embodiment of every passive-aggressive neighborhood watch sign. Her aura screamed. I have a binder for that. She came bearing a welcome basket with a bottle of questionable Chardonnay and some stale crackers. We had this stilted conversation right there in my driveway. 3:30 p.m. She talked about community standards and aesthetic harmony. I was polite. Explained I had no plans to build, just wanted to preserve the land as my family had for generations. She kept nodding, but her eyes were scanning past me, at the trees, at the sheer space of it all. It wasn't a look of admiration. It was a look of appraisal, like a butcher eyeing a prize cow. It's just wonderful to have such a large green buffer for our community, she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I felt a weird little chill then, a sense of being sized up. It was the first red flag, a little banner fluttering in the breeze that I should have paid more attention to. But I had other things on my mind. The rest of my granddad's estate, his house in another state, needed to be sorted and sold. It was a huge, emotional task. So, after securing the property, I packed up and left for what I thought would be 3, maybe 4 months. I told myself the weird vibe from Diane was just me being cynical. I left the silence of the woods for the noise of lawyers and estate agents, never imagining that back home, a war for my land was about to begin without a single shot being fired. I returned on a Tuesday in the year of the permit. The air was thick with the humidity of early summer. The first thing I noticed was the sound. It wasn't birdsong. It was the mechanical growl of heavy machinery. My heart started pounding, a deep, primal drumbeat of dread. I drove down my driveway, and when the trees cleared, the sight that greeted me, man, it literally took my breath away. It was a scene of utter devastation. A huge swath of my land, at least 5 acres along the border with Willow Creek, was a sea of red mud and raw timber. Bulldozers sat like slumbering metal beasts. And scattered across the churned-up earth were the foundations and frames of dozens of small, identical cabins. 50 of them I'd later count. They were skeletal, but unmistakably structures. My sanctuary had become a construction site. My grandfather's legacy was being turned into a cheap-looking resort. I felt this surge of adrenaline, pure, hot anger. I got out of my car, my hand shaking, and just started walking towards the chaos. That's when I saw her again. Diane. She was standing there in pristine white capri pants and a hard hat that looked so comically out of place on her lacquered hair. She was holding a clipboard, directing a group of workers. She saw me approaching, and that shark-like smile was back, only this time it held no pretense of friendliness. "Wow, hello there," she chirped, as if she'd just found me admiring her prize-winning roses. "Surprise! We've started our community expansion project. Aren't these eco-cabins just darling?" I was speechless for a second. The audacity was just, wow. It was stunning. What is this? I finally managed, my voice hoarse. "You're on my property, Diane." She actually chuckled. A short, sharp, dismissive sound. "Oh, I think you'll find you're mistaken," she said, tapping her clipboard. "According to the revised county plat maps, this is all designated HOA, common area. It was all filed properly. This is our land now." She said it with such confidence, such unwavering certainty, that for a split second, a sliver of doubt pierced my rage. Had I missed something? Some legal notice? Had my granddad sold a parcel without my knowledge? But then I remembered the stone markers, the deed in my safe, the stories. "My deed says otherwise," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I have the surveys. This is my land." She waved a dismissive hand, like I was a fly she was shooing away. "Oh, those old papers. They're so easy to misinterpret. Things change. Plans get updated. You've been gone for months. The community voted. It's all above board." That was when I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was intentional. This was theft, dressed up in HOA, regulations, and counterfeit politeness. Karen. She must have been destined to have that name. It fit her so perfectly. A title of supreme, self-righteous entitlement. The rest of her board, a few meek-looking men who had driven up in another golf cart, just stood behind her, nodding like puppets on a string. They were her enablers, basking in the reflected glow of her petty tyranny. The fight was on, but I knew screaming at her in a muddy field wasn't the way. My mind, the engineer's mind, was already shifting gears. Away from hot anger and into the realm of cold, hard logic. I was going to fight her not with volume but with data. And I was going to bury her in it. The transition from the year of the permit to the year of the titles happened almost overnight. That first week back was a blur of contained fury. I documented everything. Every morning, 7:15 a.m., I'd walk the property line, or what was left of it, with a high-resolution camera and a GPS tracker. I photographed every single cabin frame, every bulldozer, every footprint they left on my land. The visual evidence was stacking up, a gallery of trespassing and destruction. But pictures weren't enough. Diane's whole defense rested on her claim of a revised county plat map. That was the linchpin. And I knew, deep in my gut, it was a lie. So, my battleground shifted from the muddy field to the musty, quiet halls of the county records office. This place became my second home. It's a place that smells of old paper and dust, where time is measured in decades and documented in faded ink. The clerks were mostly indifferent, just doing their jobs. Except for one, an older gentleman named George. A man who had probably been there since the ink was still wet on some of the documents I was looking for. He had a weary look, but his eyes lit up when he saw the kind of deep dive I was doing. He hated bureaucratic corner-cutting and bullies. He was my first true ally. 10:30 a.m. On a Wednesday, I started by pulling the deed for my property and the master plan for the Willow Creek Estates development. George helped me find the microfilm archives. We spent hours hunched over the glowing screen, my engineering background kicking into overdrive. I saw the original survey, clear as day. It showed the development's property ending exactly where my grandfather's stone markers were. There was no ambiguity. My property was a perfect 20-acre rectangle. Theirs was a sprawling amoeba that stopped dead at my line. Now for the interesting part. I asked George if any revisions or new plat maps had been filed for Willow Creek in the last year. Funny, you should ask, he said, a little twinkle in his eye. There was a revision, filed about 3 months ago. Pushed through real quick. He pulled the file. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I unrolled the large blueprint on the table. There it was, the new map. It looked official. It had stamped signatures, and it showed a redrawn property line. A neat, clean line that sliced 5 acres right off my land and absorbed it into the HOA's common area. It was the document Diane had been waving in my face, her holy scripture of theft. But something was off. As an engineer who'd spent 30 years looking at blueprints and surveys, I have a feel for them. The line weight was slightly different. The font used for the new coordinates didn't perfectly match the original text. Dude, it was a forgery. A damn good one. The kind that would fool a layman or a busy county clerk. But to a trained eye, it was like a screaming typo. The signature on it was from a surveyor I'd never heard of. I took a picture of the name. That was one loose thread. Then my love for historical cartography, my little hobby, kicked in. I started going backwards. Not just years, but decades. I pulled county maps from the 90s, the 70s, the 50s. The line was always the same. My family's plot was inviolate. George, getting into the spirit of the hunt, said, "You know, sometimes old road-building easements can muddy the waters." That's when we hit the jackpot. 2:45 p.m. Deep in a dusty archive box, in a file so old the paper was yellow and brittle, we found it. A file from the 1940s, regarding an old plan to build a state road that never materialized. Tucked inside was a copy of my great-grandfather's original CC&RS for the property. Covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Most old family plots don't have them this formalized, but my great-granddad was a meticulous, somewhat paranoid man. It was a document designed to protect the land from anything squatters during the Depression, government seizure, you name it. I read through the spidery typescript, and then I saw the clause. The words seemed to lift off the page, glowing with a divine, vengeful light. It was a paragraph about unauthorized use. It stated, with perfect legal clarity, that any unauthorized structures, be they temporary or permanent, for commercial or residential use, erected upon the land would be subject to a retroactive land lease fine. And here was the kicker. The fine was to be levied at a rate determined by the current landowner, payable upon written demand. Man, it was shocking. It was the ultimate get-off-my-lawn clause, written with the foresight of a prophet. This wasn't just a smoking gun. This was a nuke. Diane thought she was playing checkers, fudging a few lines on a map. She had no idea she was playing chess with a ghost, and she just walked her queen right into the trap he'd set 80 years ago. The next few months moved us into the year of the tickets. And oh boy, were there a lot of tickets to write. My first call was to my old college roommate, a guy named Ben, who was now a sharp take-no-prisoners lawyer. I met him for lunch on a Friday, 12:20 p.m., when I laid out the whole story, the forged map, the construction, and the 1940s covenant. His eyes went wide. Then he started to laugh. It wasn't a ha-ha funny laugh. It was a low, predatory chuckle, the kind of sound a wolf makes when it sees a three-legged rabbit. "Are you kidding me?" he said, taking a big sip of his iced tea. "This is beautiful. It's poetic. We don't just sue them for trespassing. That's messy and takes years. We use their own rulebook against them. We use your rulebook, the one her little HOA is subordinate to. The plan we hatched was simple, brutal, and elegant. We weren't going to stop the construction. Oh no, that would have been too merciful. We were going to let them finish. We were going to let Diane pour every last dollar of the HOA's money into building 50 illegal cabins on my land. Every nail, every 2x4, every window pane was just adding to the bill they didn't even know they were racking up. This phase of the plan was the hardest. It was emotionally wrenching. Every day, I had to watch them. 8 a.m., the roar of the generators would wake me up. I'd see crews swarming over my property, the very land my grandfather had so carefully preserved. They were erasing his legacy one structure at a time. The wild meadow was gone. The old-growth trees they'd cut down were stacked like cordwood. It felt like a physical violation, a deep personal wound. There were days my anger was so hot I just wanted to go out there and scream, to stand in front of a bulldozer. But Ben's voice was always in my ear. "Patience. Let them dig their own grave. The deeper they dig, the more satisfying it will be to push them in." So I channeled that anger into meticulous preparation. I became a professional spy on my own land. I bought a half-dozen high-end trail cams, the kind hunters use, and placed them in strategic locations, capturing time-lapsed video of the entire construction process from multiple angles. I kept a detailed log. 9:37 a.m. A concrete truck arrives. 11:52 a.m. Roofing materials are delivered. 4:10 p.m. Diane shows up in her golf cart to inspect the progress, smiling and pointing. Every entry was another nail in her coffin. While the physical work continued, Ben and I were busy with the legal work. We hired a reputable court-certified surveyor, a different one, obviously, to do a brand new, fully documented survey of my land, using the old stone markers and the original county records. His report confirmed, unequivocally, that all 50 cabins were entirely on my property, not just a foot or two over the line. The entire little village was trespassing. We also did a deep dive into Diane's pet surveyor, the one who signed the forgery. It turned out he had a history of friendly surveys and a couple of official reprimands from the state board. We filed a formal complaint, loaded with our evidence of the forgery. That was a separate time bomb, just waiting to go off. Then came the final, most satisfying piece of the puzzle, calculating the fine. The covenant said the rate was to be determined by the landowner. Ben and I spent an evening brainstorming. Ben and I spent an evening brainstorming. We didn't want a number that was crazy enough to be thrown out of court. It had to be high, but justifiable. We researched commercial land lease rates, resort development costs, and punitive damage precedents. We settled on a nice round number, a number that was both astronomical and defensible, $500,000 per cabin. It was based on a retroactive lease for the land value, plus penalties for the destruction of the natural habitat and the unauthorized commercial development. $500,000 times 50 cabins. A grand total of $25 million. Just saying the number out loud felt insane. But it was legal. It was supported by the 80-year-old document Diane had no idea even existed. So we waited. Summer turned to fall. The cabins were finished. They were landscaped. They even put in little gravel paths and solar-powered lights. They were preparing for a grand opening, a celebration of their new community asset. And I just watched, holding an arsenal of evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to drop the bomb. The year of the finds began on a crisp Saturday in October. It was the day of the Willow Creek Estates Autumn Festival and Cabin Grand Opening. The HOA had sent out glossy flyers. There was going to be a bouncy house for the kids, a chili cook-off, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony right in the middle of their stolen village. The whole community was buzzing. My ally George from the records office had even tipped me off that a local news crew was supposed to be there. It was perfect. They were setting their own stage for their own public humiliation. But I wasn't going to make a scene at the festival. That wasn't my style. The main event for me was the emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for 1 hour before the festival. 10 a.m. They were meeting in the community clubhouse to finalize the last-minute details. This was the moment. I put on my best suit. Ben met me at the end of my driveway, looking sharp and carrying a thick leather briefcase that practically radiated menace. We weren't alone. As per Ben's recommendation, we had a professional process server with us, a large, impassive man named Frank, and for good measure, we'd requested a civil standby from the sheriff's department. 2 deputies parked discreetly down the road, just to ensure things remained civil. We walked into the clubhouse. The entire board was there. Diane was at the head of the table, in her element, basking in the glow of her achievement. When she saw me and Ben walk in, her face soured immediately. "This is a closed meeting," she snapped. "This is board members only." I gave her a calm, thin smile. "I believe I have business with the board, Diane. Business that can't wait." Before she could argue, Ben stepped forward and placed his briefcase on the table with a heavy, final-sounding thud. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "my client, the legal owner of the land you've recently developed, has a presentation for you." What followed was 20 minutes of glorious, beautiful, and utterly silent chaos. Ben didn't raise his voice once. He spoke in a calm, methodical tone as he laid it all out. He started with the certified copy of my deed. Then he unrolled the new official survey map, showing the 50 cabins covering a huge section of my property. He presented the sworn affidavit from the court-certified surveyor. He showed them satellite photos from a year ago, pristine woods, and photos from today, a budget resort. Diane started to bluster. "This is ridiculous. We have our own map, our own survey. It's all legal." That's when Ben played the ace. He pulled out the blown-up, certified copy of the 1940s covenant. He slid it across the table to her. "I believe this predates your HOA by about 60 years, he said. He read the land lease clause out loud, his voice ringing through the stunned silence of the room. The other board members, the meek enablers, were starting to look pale. Their eyes darted from the document, to me, to Diane. You could see the dawning horror on their faces. They were realizing they had been led off a cliff by a woman in a hard hat. This is crazy," one of them stammered. "You can't just invent a fine." "Oh, I'm not inventing it," I said, speaking for the first time. "My great-grandfather did 80 years ago. I'm just collecting." And then came the grand finale. Ben nodded to Frank, the process server. Frank stepped forward and placed a massive 3-ring binder in front of Diane. "For you," Ben said. "What is this?" she whispered, her bravado finally cracking. "That," Ben said, "is 50 individual invoices, one for each of the 50 structures you have illegally built on my client's land. As per the covenant, the landowner has determined the retroactive land lease fine to be $500,000 per structure. You'll also find a formal demand for the immediate removal of all structures and the full restoration of the land to its original condition. The total amount due is $25 million, payable in 30 days. Wow, this officer is unbelievable. Except this officer was me, and the ticket was a nuke. The room erupted. Diane was screaming, calling us crooks, liars. The other board members were shouting at her, at each other. You told us it was clear. You told us the paperwork was solid. The festival outside, the bouncy house, and the chili was about to begin. But inside that room, the party was already over. The sheriff's deputies stepped in as the shouting escalated, their calm presence sucking the air out of Diane's tantrum. The news crew, arriving for the festival, saw the commotion and smelling blood rushed over with their cameras. They caught Diane being restrained by her own board members, her face a mask of purple rage. It was the perfect, humiliating end to her reign. The fallout was swift and brutal. The HOA's insurance carrier took one look at the evidence of fraud. The forged plat map was the nail in that coffin and denied their claim. Facing a $25 million judgment they had no hope of paying, Willow Creek Estates filed for bankruptcy within 2 months. Diane was removed as president, sued by multiple homeowners, and was, last I heard, facing state charges for the fraudulent filing. As for me, the legal battle ended with a settlement. I didn't get $25 million, of course. You can't get blood from a stone. But I got a significant 7-figure sum from the bankrupt estate, enough to cover all my legal fees and then some. More importantly, the settlement stipulated that the defunct HOA was responsible for the full cost of demolishing the 50 cabins and starting the environmental restoration of my land. It's a long process. The land is scarred, and it will be for years. Seeing the cabins torn down piece by piece was a sad, somber affair. I won, but the perfect, untouched sanctuary my grandfather left me is gone, and that's a loss I'll always feel. But the story doesn't end there. Last Thursday, 1:15 p.m., I finalized the plans. Using the settlement money, I've established a trust. The entire 20 acres is being permanently placed in a conservation easement and turned into the Johnston Family Nature Preserve. There will be walking trails for the public and a small plaque dedicated to my grandfather. No one will ever try to build on it again. In the end, Diane's greed didn't just cost her money and power. It ended up guaranteeing my family's legacy forever. She tried to steal 5 acres, and in doing so, she protected all 20. And that, my friends, is a revenge that will last long after the scars on the land have faded, and her name is nothing but a forgotten piece of bad neighborhood history.